But so before I go to the questions in my hand, I will throw it open to the audience to get started. Would anyone like to get us going? That's a scratch, not a question, wasn't it? You're teasing me there. Yeah, please, Chris at the back.
Chris Jarvis from the Environment Agency in the UK. I'm a data provider, I guess, for the Environment Agencies. Two quick questions. One for Ed. Just around, you mentioned your history with the Ordnance Survey. So I was thinking about, we collect data about things in the environment, and we're not too bad at that. We can, measure the flow in a river, or the level in a river, or the water quality sample in a river. We're not as good at knowing where that river is, or being able to tell other people where that is. So when we publish our data, we have to give an X and Y and then the attributes. Just your view on people like Ordnance Survey or other providers of, I tend to think of it as core reference data that other people can attribute to, and the power of doing that via linked data, and whether you see movement in that direction across the piece.
Thanks for the question, Chris. It's complicated, as you might imagine, and particularly the history of Ordnance Survey and open data is quite complicated and would make a very good novel that you could write with heroes and villains and the whole thing. But your fundamental point is a good one, and I think it identifies a need for, or recognises a need for key data sets that, if you remember back to the graph that John showed of the kind of the universe of open linked data, there are data sets that are very important that sit in the core of that graph that are then referenceable by other types of data. And geospatial data sets, I think, are very important in creating that core that you can then link to. And I think there is a role for mapping agencies or organizations that are responsible for collecting and maintaining these data sets to accept the role of saying, well, as part of our duty, we have to make these linkable data sets that are core pieces of the infrastructure of a nation's data framework. We have to make them openly accessible and linkable without the constraints that are often there currently. So I think it's something that is kind of hard to really point at the best practice of saying, there's a place where it's happening well at a national scale, but you can see it happening at a kind of a local and a municipal scale in some cities around the world and in some regional governments, where they are making this kind of core data set of geospatial data available, linkable, and it forming then the sort of the basic data framework that other people can link to.
Thanks. Sorry, Chris, did you say you had another question there, or?
Sorry. Oh yeah. My other question just was for Emma. You mentioned about data, in the past quotes about data being the new oil, and you said about the data being the new roads. I heard someone else say that data is the new asbestos, and sometimes, in an organisation, in a role trying to publish the data, that sometimes feels very real. I just wonder, any thoughts on that?
Do you mean that it's the sort of thing that nobody wants to accidentally find?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is our middle microphone working?
I did say I wasn't techie, including not being able to find the on button. I think for us, talking about data as roads is intended to try and make people feel more relaxed about it. So I can't imagine us adopting the asbestos metaphor anytime soon. But I certainly understand the point that, asbestos is very useful, isn't it? You just don't want to touch it. I think for data too, it's partly about people feeling more comfortable about touching it and what that means for them. So I think there are a lot of people who are very nervous about data, partly because they see it working in a particular way, or they've heard horror stories, or often they've imagined horror stories, very few of which, as far as I know, have actually come true. I feel like the gloves that help people use the asbestos or the face mask or whatever is required is basically a little bit of education, especially for people within government, that in order to use data competently, they don't need to become massive data nerds. They don't need to understand everything about their spreadsheets or about metadata or about linked data or anything like that. They just need to feel a little bit more comfortable about what information they have, who can see it, who needs to see it, and things like that.
Would anyone else on the panel like to respond to either of those questions before we move on? If not, then I'll ask for the next question, please. Yeah, Wolfgang, please.
Thank you, John. Question to Barbara Ryan about publicly owned satellites versus privately owned satellites. It was amazing to see your figures from Landsat when they were released freely, how the use exploded all of a sudden. But of course, they were publicly owned satellites. And we see an increasing tendency that satellites are more and more built by private entities. To be used more, does it mean they have to give their data away free of charge? But then their business model would be gone, of course. On the other side, the burden would be on the government to buy or to own all these satellites. So where is there a good work sharing between the public and the private sector in providing satellite data?
Yeah, let's see, great question. So a couple things. Well, first of all, let's go back to the U.S. example, because the United States wanted to put some policies in place that created a private sector commercial space industry. And so there were two companies at the time, GOI and Digital Globe, that were largely financed by the federal government. It would have been the Defense Department. So our issue, one was to the tune of $400 million, another one was with a big contract for maybe $500 million, so close to $1 billion. And our problem over on the civilian side, the U.S. Geological Survey, was that the federal government called it a data buy. And so we then, on the civilian side in the Geological Survey, had to buy data from those two companies, even after the citizens of the United States roughly sunk about $1 billion into those two companies. So it was on those grounds that we were saying, you know, we think it's great if the U.S. wants to have a policy to support a particular private sector market, just don't call it a data buy after we spend $1 billion for data. And so now fast forward, both companies were not supportable, so they've downscaled to one company, so there's now one commercial provider. So that's the context for us pushing for broad open data off that money that the taxpayers already paid for. I can tell you the conversations that we're having, whether it be with Digital Globe now or Planet, which used to be Planet Labs, is if they do in fact have an anchor tenant that will in fact kind of finance most of their operations, then they are much more open to having a broad open data policy. So that tends to be with the new startups that you're talking about. They do need an anchor tenant somewhere. Not that it has to come from the government, but it could come from someone else, and then they'd be more open to having an open data policy. The other conversation that's taken place is what's the value of their archive? So how much data are they truly selling out of their archive? You know, if 90% of their data sales is coming from data that's, or even higher, let's say 95% of their data sales is coming from data that's less than a year old, and they're only generating 5% of their income from all the archive could we enter into a discussion with them where they would start to open up that historic archive broadly and openly available. So I guess I would say I'm actually quite optimistic about the conversations that are taking place with the private sector, but recognize they do operate under a different business model. But it may not be quite as black and white as it used to be over the first, the last 20 years.
Thank you very much. I know I'm sitting on another question from you, Wolfgang, as well, because I saw you putting this on the board. I'll sit on that for a few more minutes, if you don't mind, because it's a really great question I want to explore a bit further. But can I just ask if there are any more from the audience for the moment? If not, I'll fire one in the direction of the far end of the panel over there. But Jose Miguel suddenly looks very uncomfortable. But I just wondered, from the, I guess going into my top question here, from the point of view of your view in the Commission, we've been pursuing open data policies, some countries more actively than others for many years now. Do you think there's any threats along the way that we should be, what have we learned as a kind of continent about this? Do we have to change our approach from how we initially started this movement?
Don't know if it's working.
That's working,
okay,
yeah.
great. Well, in my opinion, I think we are going in the right direction, but there's still a long way to do it to really reach and to really achieve a real open data and open access environment in Europe. I think there is still a lot to do in terms of capacity building in public governments. I think there is still a lot to do within national governments to ensure that there are open data flows within the administration and vis-a-vis business and vis-a-vis the citizens. For example, I mean, I'm thinking now in of the last evaluation of the Inspire Directive, which, as you may know, is about directive to put into place a spatial data infrastructure for Europe. And what they found in the revision of the implementation of the directive, there are still a lot of barriers within the public sector to share the data. And this is actually hindering, in the case of the Inspire Directive, the fulfillment of the use of this kind of data for fulfilling the environmental policies. No? So on one side, I think there is still a lot to do in terms of capacity building, raising awareness. I think in order to do that, all examples that, for example, we have seen from the speakers of the Open Data Institute and in the incubator, I think these are great examples to really try to convince policymakers about the need of opening up the data. We need champions within the public sector. I think, as Emma was saying, civil servants have really a role there to play. Coming originally from a national mapping agency in Spain, I think this a role that I think is very, very important. And also, of course, there are still technological challenges. I'm aware that there is a big fragmentation in accessing the data across Europe. We are working towards fixing this, towards really solving this fragmentation, but there is still a way to go.
Thank you very much indeed. I just wanted to link a little bit with what Emma was talking about, because I think one of the things that struck me about Emma's presentation, particularly remembering the photo which we actually tweeted of all those people working together, the government and the SMEs and all the rest of it. It struck me that although we've worked with our own government departments quite a lot, not only within the Melodies project, but elsewhere as well, I'm not sure we've achieved that level of working together. And I wondered whether there's some initiatives we could think about within the UK and within Europe for getting that level of integration. I mean, we can talk to our government departments and we can be friendly with them, but actually having that kind of day-to-day interaction on it and developing applications, I think would strike me to be beneficial. If you have any recommendations or follow-up on that, that would be great.
I think one of the reasons why it's worked so well in Mexico is because there are some actually really special characteristics of that team, which I would love to have replicated everywhere, but which I'm aware aren't. So, for example, 3 weeks after being in Mexico, I was trying to advise the Malaysian government on how to achieve something similar, and it was really difficult. The group of people who are doing this work in Mexico come from the same kind of background as the startups themselves. So the Mexican government has made a real effort, especially in their e-government work, to bring in people who have a startup background, for example, or who have some private sector experience. So I think it's one of those problems that is so much more complex than just bringing government on board. It's about the kind of people who work in government and who work in these policy areas, and the importance of them having real experience of what it's like to be an entrepreneur, or what it's like to find it challenging to deal with government, because I think they then bring a perspective to their work in government that makes it a lot easier for them then to deal with entrepreneurs in a slightly different way. So they still do things like boss the entrepreneurs around a little bit more than they would like, and I'm sure the smiles in that photo aren't all completely genuine, but certainly it makes it a little bit easier for them to work through problems together, because I think they have a bit more common understanding.
Great, thank you very much. Please do raise your hand with any questions or follow-ups, or even the panel, if you want to ask yourselves a question. Well, not yourselves, each other a question. You can ask yourself a question if you want, but that's maybe not the most entertaining thing to do. Yeah, thanks. No, that's Uli. Sorry, I could just see your hand, but I couldn't see your face. Hi, Uli.
The fourth question on the list there, I find that really quite interesting, and I'm wondering what all the panel thinks about it. Ed has already mentioned he reckons it's still early on for linked data, but where are we on that trajectory if you think it's going somewhere, and how long might it take for it to go somewhere? Thanks.
So Hervé has not spoken yet, so I might give Hervé the first chance to speak in that case.
That's a question for Oracle, no? The Oracle, sorry.
If you don't want to take it first, we can go back to...
No, actually, we discussed in some occasions during the project this topic. We identified that there is a ramp-up, an effort for training on the new tools that are supporting this type of publication on the web. And actually, we have different levels, whether you need to build a database that will support your portal. And actually, you will be the only one seeing the link data behind your portal, and you will engineer this, and this will serve requests on a map. Or you want also to publish this on the web for others. In a partnership settings, you will create an API on top of this link data, and you could imagine a business on top of this. So I think that we are quite mature. We saw in Melodies a lot of partners building portals and delivering data and information out of linked data. It took some training and effort, but we've reached this level of maturity. We saw from John's presentation that linked data on the web is quite growing. We have a lot of existing initiatives interlinking together. So for me, I want to be optimistic, and I would say that we are quite close. That's my bet for the future.
I don't know which order to do this in, because I know that maybe not everybody on the panel will have direct experience with this to answer a question. But Luis, you could either you're welcome to take an answer if you like.
Yeah. It's working. Yeah. In my opinion, as a researcher, because my background is computer science research, and I've worked with linked data technologies and have done research in linked data technologies. For me, linked data is a decentralization technology. And currently, the centralized approach are very successful in being very efficient and also to generate a lot of value from the fact that they have centralized information. So I think technologically, as Hervé is saying, we are very close, but only when we can enable, in a way, decentralized use cases or use cases, business cases that rely on decentralization, then, well, linked data will be there to be the provider that we need.
My very brief comment would be to back up what Ed was saying about linked data, that even if the technology is improving, I spend most of my time talking to governments and to big companies and small companies, and their interest does not tend to lie here. I think partly because they're not yet convinced on why it's exciting.
And then just, I suppose, reinforce my point. I think there's certainly promise for linked data, and I think many of us do see the web fundamentally as a federated source of information. Then linked data is ultimately the right approach to take. I think part of the problem, as we see it today, is we've made it overly complicated, and we've drummed up a whole industry around creating domain-specific ontologies and crafting RDF, and it is way too academic, way too practitioners. There are simpler ways of doing linked data, and that's what we need to start people off with. Just fundamentally publishing things with an identifier that is linkable. Just using, HTTP URIs is a great starting point, without any of this RDF semantic nonsense. If we can just do that to start, then we can build more sophisticated solutions as we go along. If I have to have a PhD in computer science to publish linked data, it's not going to happen.
So I have a related question here, actually, which might bring this question a little bit more into Barbara's field, unless you want to take an answer straight away. But
go ahead.
But just before I do that, would anyone like to respond to Ed's views here? Particularly those are the projects with more linked data kind of. But yeah, Manolis, there you go. Just please wait for the mic if you would.
I think that Ed in the past has said worse things about the same kind of technologies. So I was in a conference in Rome, ODBase, in 2013, I think, or 12. So now I think he has improved very much, and I'm happy to hear that at least they can support URIs, for example, and HTTP. Yeah. So, but we are moving forward, I think. Yeah. All of us do that. So,
thank you. Is there anything else before I shift slightly? So the question I wanted to come to here was another one was Wolfgang's question that he put on the board kindly earlier, and this was about thinking about linked data in the context of satellite imagery and large archives such as that. So. If I may paraphrase your question, Wolfgang, it's about saying, well, to make these large archives, which might be Landsat, it might be Sentinel, more linkable, let's say, more part of the open web, rather than thinking of them in terms of images, we should be thinking about them in terms of features, and things like towns and roads and vineyards is a good example down here, and making them available in that form, rather than saying, here's an image. You should be saying, as a user, I might want to say I want a cloud-free image of all the vineyards in the UK or something like that, and use that as an API. Is that a fair reflection of your question, Wolfgang? Yes, exactly. Yeah, we've talked about this before. So I think, is that a service that we should build? Maybe we should go ahead and build that. Maybe Jose Miguel can figure out how to fund that kind of service for the. From the EC, but yes, Barbara, I'll let you respond.
Yeah, exactly. No, I totally agree, because even for me, what the Australian Data Cube did is, while those bigger chunks may have been scenes that came in, were ingested, the analysis was a pixel by pixel analysis. So it wasn't an image by image analysis at all. So it was already starting to break it down, which is why I think on a pixel by pixel basis, we ought to be able to go into the attributes associated with that individual pixel. So I agree entirely. And I guess maybe that is what I might have said about this linked data issue is, I mean, I am optimistic that the whole community will move in that direction. But for me, I'd like to go back to, I think it was Jose Miguel's presentation. We still got challenges out there on enabling or on open data. When you sent your questions around, John, Wenbo Chu, who does most of our data sharing work on the Secretariat staff, gave me some statistics from an open data barometer report that was maybe issued in 2016. And of the roughly 100, I guess there were 92 countries that were surveyed. 55% said they had an open data initiative within their government, but only 6 of those 92 were even close to open by default. The countries that were named were Austria, Canada, Italy, Moldova, the UK, and the USA. And there was really very, very limited progress on the number of truly open data sets. Mm-hmm. So I think, while normally I'm an optimist, I think we've got to go back out and still push open data, because we aren't going to get to link data until we've got some data to link. So that's all I would have said.
Thanks very much. And Wolfgang, I don't know whether you've seen, there's a system that's been developed by, I think his name is Jérôme Gasperi he was at CNES, but I'm not sure he is anymore. It's called Resto, and this is worth looking at. And he took a satellite data set, I can't remember which one it was, it might have been Landsat, and cross-correlated it with Corin land cover. So he wasn't doing any image analysis on the satellite data, but what he was taking the polygons out of Corin land cover and just applying those to the satellite images. So you could actually search the satellite imagery archive by land cover classification, which wasn't done on the satellite images, but it's an independent data set. So I can sort of visualize a service that builds on that and takes all kinds of open data, maybe closed data as well, and cross-correlates it and makes available a value-added data set of a Landsat or a Sentinel or something like that that has these annotations that you're talking about. So maybe we should try and build that by next week. Yeah. Sorry, I'll just let Wolfgang talk, and then maybe Ed will come in.
Thank you, John. I wasn't aware of this guy. I will maybe dig into it. Just giving you a simple example. Nivelles is a small place near Brussels here. When you type Nivelles in a search engine, take Google or whatever, you hardly will get any satellite image. You will get Wikipedia, you will get the local website and everything. But there may be hundreds of satellite images you would not find in your search because the name Nivelles is not annotated in the image.
Yeah.
And that must be changed in order to make an explosive use of things. When people find the images, then they will see their value and will use it more.
I think that's presumably how I think it was Hervé who mentioned the open web and the closed web. We said we are, in EO data, we're only interacting with the open web on the ground floor. Was that your quote, Hervé? And then there's a whole skyscraper above that, which is not part of the open web. But I think Ed wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think we may be thinking about the wrong audience, or at least the wrong room. So in this audience here, we can see the sense, we can understand the problem that we'd like to semantically tag individual scenes of imagery that have their extent and the place names, and so we could search for an image of a particular place. But actually, probably for the vast majority of potential customers, for the information that image contains, they're more interested in another information product that's derived from the image. So they might be interested in forest cover, or how much of the arable agriculture in that image has been impacted by a particular disease. And they're after actually information products that are derived from the images themselves, not the images. We're doing a lot of work with Terabella looking at very high cadence image capture of ports to count shipping containers, using machine learning to do the interpretation of the images and literally count the shipping containers. And that information is provided to end users not as images, but as cells in a spreadsheet saying, here are the number of shipping containers in this port on this day. And maybe because we think in terms of the raw data that we deal with, we're perhaps missing the point, and that most people will want an information product that is derived from that imagery.
Yeah, Barbara, please.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And then let me just tell you maybe one other story just in terms of building on the comments that we often make it more complicated than it is, and maybe for these same reasons we kind of get blinders on. Harry, in your presentation you cited a quotation by Jim Gray out of Microsoft, and so I had an opportunity to work with him when he was still alive. And what Microsoft at the time wanted to do was just serve up a lot of data. So they first went to the Mormon Church and looked at their genealogy data, and I don't know, came up with, I don't know how much data, but you know, a fair amount, and then realized that, well, maybe some privacy issues with really kind of distributing this data. So then they went to the New York Stock Exchange just for numbers of transactions so that they could serve up the numbers of transactions over the last decade. And still it didn't get them to a terabyte of data. And then they learned about the U.S. Geological Survey. We had aerial photography for the entire United States. And finally, you were able to look at a terabyte of data with that aerial photography data. So for me, that's quite interesting, because whether you went from genealogy data to stock exchange data to aerial photography, for them it was just digits. It was just zeros and ones that they wanted to serve up. And I think what happens is we get caught in it not just being digits, we get caught up in the richness and the wonderfulness of all this data, but I think sometimes it gets in our way. Now, I guess we could fast forward and say Microsoft never really, I think, got behind the research unit, Jim Gray, to do that. And then I think it was probably about that time that Google really, really took off. But I know Microsoft started thinking about large data, you know, back in the late 80s and early 90s.
Thanks very much. Hervé, I think you have a follow-up.
Yes, for the commercial sector, with Earth observation, clearly the trend is to sell information readily now. You see Planet Labs, Google, all the new constellations of nanosatellites. They are cheap satellites. They are constellations of tens of satellites, and they orbit the Earth to get daily updates. And this daily acquisition of all the same point gives you change detection, and this is automated, and you sell this information. So for me, the story is quite done already. I don't see, maybe like the records, someone will sell images in the future. But for me, this is over. But for science, we are not providing images for the human eye. All the sensors orbiting the Earth for science, they are really capturing, sensing information for the computer. And the story of Jim Gray is the history of science from analytical science. Well, first of all, experimental science in the history from the Greeks. And this evolution of science in different steps. And the fourth paradigm is the shift from using your computer to run some little computation on a model, so from science using models, to data-intensive science, where you will extract big facts, because just you have access to massive amounts of data, like the data cubes we heard about. And so here the human eye is just coming in the story at the far end of this story, when you have to analyze trends or phenomena over decades, like studying climate change. So linked data would really come as Ed was saying, at the far end where you need to share the outcomes, the results of this processing, and how you can connect this to other databases. And then satellites are just a sensor feed in your history, in this story.
Thank you very much. And
so just I wanted to complete.
Sorry, go ahead.
So, but it's still possible to do interesting work with satellite data from sensors, for science. Earth observation is not only an array of pixels, an array of measurements. It's a lot more than this, and this is where we have also some work to do. You have the lineage of the data, you have the sensor parameters, you have really a lot of information coming along with this array of measurements, which are essentials for the scientists to do the work with the data. So linking the quality assurance informations related to what we call metadata to this array, and linking to the sensor orbit, and all these data are critical and can be more easily linked in terms of linked open data to help scientists retrieve the information that their computer will process and understand where are the data gaps, understand where are the complementarities of when we are now close to achieve continuity in the observations from the different missions. And GEO is acting for mission continuity like CEOS is doing. This is where we have to support the scientists to retrieve the information that can feed their models.
So I think I saw two hands, but I'm slightly blinded here. Tom, did you have your hand up? And then I think it was Manolis. Please, Tom.
Did the panel know of any examples of sort of dynamically linked open data? So something that popped into my head, it was sort of thinking about Ed's challenge about the RDF PhD and making it a little bit more accessible. So somebody comes along and says, okay, sorry, Siri, you know, where's a tapas bar in the middle of Brussels? Okay, so far so good, that's all conventional. And then they say, okay, oh, I like that one. What's it like there? And it goes off, and it gets the Met feed, so is it raining? Then it gets the pollen count, then it gets the crowdsourced pollution levels, and then it gets also the known crime statistics in the area. Oh, and any reviews that people have of it, and just pulls that all back in dynamically.
If you know who's doing that, I'd love to know. I think we're getting close. We're getting close with lighter rate technologies. So some of the microdata formats, if you look at what schema.org are doing with some JSON LD encoding of pages, it takes into account the dynamic nature of some content on the web and does look to that. So it's beginning, and I think we'll see it. And I think the example of you talking about Siri is the thing that's going to drive this. The semantic web is going to be driven by the needs of those sorts of assistant applications that need that content to really expand. And I think that might be the solution to making the linked web grow, because we finally found a user that wants it. And that user are these assistant technologies.
I think, Manolis, I think you had your hand up too.
Thank you, John. So what I wanted to point out is that regarding work on Earth observation data and extracting knowledge from such data, we had done quite a lot of work on that in Project Telios. So, for example, the National Observatory of Athens built something similar to the data cube that we saw from Barbara. This had to do with burned areas in the forests of Greece over the years using Landsat images. And we had also done some work with DLR that has somehow, I think, ended up in the ground segment of Terra Sarix, their satellite, radar satellite, where using machine learning techniques, we discover classes of interesting things on satellite images, and then we offer a way to query the ground segment using these classes together with linked data. So, but I don't know how far this has progressed as an operational technology inside DLR.
I think my own view on a lot of this linked data stuff is it will be successful when nobody knows it's happening. You know, the technology that we're working on is that will come to the surface in things like search engine results or applications that people build, and the number of people that need to know about the linked data layer. It may be very important for the application developer, but how many of the end users need to know about that? I think I know a few people who are building businesses, for example, which are using linked data entirely internally, and they're using the whole linked data stack of RDF and Sparkle, but they're not exposing that then to the user. They're still getting value from that whole stack, but then there's a layer above. There's an API, or there's an interface, or there's something that gives out schema.org for a search engine, or CSV files for the Excel spreadsheet warriors and that kind of thing. And in my personal view, I think that's the way it fits in the stack. It's there, but it's not necessarily obviously there. So, sorry, was that a? Sorry, I thought I had a question. Yeah, I think that's Gabrielle over there. Sorry, I'm being slightly blinded here. Thanks, Manolis.
I would like to ask Barbara if there is any institutional initiative to promote the use of open data in developing countries, but at the government level, possibly for reporting to international conventions. I say this because in a recent meeting of the Convention to Combat Desertification, I could see that many countries failed to provide the reports because they were not aware of open geospatial databases. One of them, for example, is the Global Summary of the Day, which they didn't know, and they said they had not a climatic network. So is it there something in that line?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are a number of things. Of course, we're advocating for it globally, but we've got a couple initiatives, one in Africa, one in the Americas, merging one in Asia and the Himalayas. And of course, this weekend it was up in the Arctic to talk about the Arctic area, to maybe downscale what we're doing globally to these other regions. So that's one thing, to advocate at lower organizational entities and also at the region, geographic scales and nationally, the importance of broad open data policies. Let's just take Africa though. We have examples where the Met Service in South Africa, Meteorological Agency, is still selling data. And so then we have other agencies in South Africa that are building weather stations because they don't want to have to pay the Met Service for the data. So what we're trying to do is go back to those governments and say, this is not a good value proposition for your government. So give the Met Service the $70,000 or the $100,000 that they are getting from selling that data. So raise their budget by that amount, and then put policies in place where they just give the data away and you will make money. So it's that political engagement with the ministers that we want to have. And to some extent, you mentioned UNCCD or UNCBD, the biological, or Minamata. The other place we're trying to engage is with those UN conventions so that they could, in fact, encourage their member states to adopt more broad open data policies as well.
To answer your question, particularly the part about initiatives for open data for development, it's really interesting to learn some of those particular examples about potential uses of open data. It's something that we've been working on at ODI for 3 years now. We're part of a partnership called the Open Data for Development Partnership, which is funded originally by the World Bank, but via the IDRC, which is the International Development Research Centre, which is part of the Canadian government's aid agency. This stuff always gets really complicated. And the kinds of funders who are also working on this are funders like, the World Bank has been very active in this space, so they fund our work in Tanzania along with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is part of the US government's aid agency. Similarly, USAID is paying for work we're doing on open data in Ukraine and has paid in the past for work we've done in Rwanda. Through the Open Data for Development Partnership, we've also worked in places like Burkina Faso, Morocco, South Africa, Botswana and Colombia. So there's a lot going on in the world on open data for development. One of the really interesting questions to me over the past year or so as the Sustainable Development Goals have been negotiated and agreed is the role of data in those. So I think everyone is really clear that open data is a wonderful tool for measurement and for tracking the success towards meeting those goals, success or otherwise. What I think there is less understanding of is using data as a policy tool in itself to help achieve goals rather than just as a monitoring mechanism. And that's something that we're pushing for.
Thanks very much. I'm aware we've only got about 5 minutes left before, I think A, before Ed has to go, and B, before the drinks start getting served outside. So so just before I take a question from Ugo, who I think was next, I just wanted to go to Twitter, because I did say I'd monitor Twitter. We've been inundated by a question from Tris. And Tris, the question was, if I remember right, how do we build communities around open data? So I think I might just pass that to Lewis and Emma, and maybe just in the interest of time, I'll focus the question a little bit, kind of, if you had one recommendation to make to someone who has an open data set to publish, and they want to build up interest in it and a community around it, what do you think they should do? What would be your recommendation as the action they should take?
I'll go first while Lewis is thinking. This is a recommendation based partly on a workshop that we held in Malaysia about a month ago, where the government was amazed to find that so many people cared about open data, and they hadn't met most of them before, even though they were the open data team. So I actually think recommendation 1 is find 10 people who care and ask them all to invite 100 people to something. They won't all show up. And just tell them what you're doing and share a few things with them, because something as simple as that is often not done. And it is really interesting that what happens at things like that is not just government sharing, but the community starts sharing with one another, and that's also how the community can meet one another.
Right, so we should all write down 10 people who care. That sounds like a good start.
Yeah, building on what Emma just said, I think, yes, 10 people who cares and 10 people with a different data set or a different interest to profit from the network effect. Because sometimes the value or the interest you can draw from a single data set is limited, but if you find the connections with other data sets, then it becomes much more powerful and much more interesting.
So there you go, back to linked data again in some way. So I think we'll go for Ugo and then maybe the last question in front of Ugo there.
Okay, thank you. A question for Luis concerning the Open Oil project, the one concerning the reports from oil companies and so. I found it very interesting because it is a good example of a shift between open data to open information. So gathering data from different sparse sources and extracting information. So first of all, I think it would be very interesting to expand this concept also to other sectors. Typically, industries having impact on the environment, so to generalize this approach. And I also wonder how they manage the verification of consistency between different reports, and if they also envisaged some form of verification, some validation with other open data to validate the data from the reports?
Well, I unfortunately don't have all the technical details because the project, the Aleph index they did, during the 6 months they were with us, was mostly the indexing part. I think what you are saying is in their plans, because of course at least the verification part needs to be in their plans, but they're relying, as they work a lot, they are not techies at the beginning. They are most consultants for governments. So they still rely on that part for on humans to make the verification, because they started with the index. That's what they did with ODA. I think that the verification is on their plans, but if you want, I can give you their contact and you can talk to them directly.
Okay, thank you.
I think maybe the final question. Yes, please, yes. Sorry, I can't see properly with this.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I'll try to be quick.
Yeah.
The thing is that while working, I saw that, well, as I said before, there should be like a core of data sets that works like a foundation for any open platform or system to share data. But yet, probably the most important one is not free, is not open, and we're talking about the geocoded address systems. Each country has its own, I know it's complicated, but it's 2016, people are tracked every minute by a cell phone. Is that difficult to understand where a building has been for the last 50 years? The question is, do we want to know if that building has been built properly, when it was built, does it respect the codes, the building codes, and so on? Can we use remote sensing to understand how high is that building? Can we use it to understand the construction type, the type of roofs, and so on? And this is probably a question for Mr. Rubio, because I understand this is very difficult to implement, and each country works in a different way. So the question is, shouldn't be there like some political willingness from the European Union to enforce the countries to come up with a standardized system to share this information and to make them open? Because, I mean, nowadays the only country I know that is making the address data open is Australia, and it's going very well. There are already a lot of implementations about this type of data set.
So nice easy question to finish with.
Okay. Well, I will come back to the example of the Inspire Directive. In the Inspire Directive, if you are familiar, there are a total of 36 or 34 data themes, and the first group of data themes is about core reference data, and one of the themes is addresses. So addresses fall under the scope of this directive. So there is already a sort of legal obligation to share data within the scope of the Inspire Directive for fulfilling legal environmental obligations. Then how each country is implementing the directive according to their own regulation, according to their own systems, that's another thing. And actually the implementation of the directive is not yet finished. We are still in the making, no? So we will have to see by 2020 how far we have arrived. But I mean, having been worked in addresses in my previous job, I understand the complex of all this kind of data and how to make this data comparable with other countries. And I think it's still an effort, but I mean, there is some sort of legal basis already there to share this kind of data. So I hope we will manage to improve this. On the other side, I wanted to, I'm not involved actually in the implementation of the Inspire Directive and within DG Research, so we are more looking for how to really help thinking now about the next work plan for Horizon 2020 that we are now starting to think. We will publish next year for 2018 till 2020. What we have seen from conferences like this one, well, we are still starting this, but from workshops, talking to geospatial and Earth observation experts, is that the issues of data assimilation and data integration are really important, especially in order to create new applications, new products and services. And it's an idea that, of course, we don't know exactly how the work program for next years will be, because it depends very much on the member states. But clearly, the creation of new applications, new services based on openly accessible data and on integrating official remote sensing in situ, crowdsourcing data, this will be, of course, on the table to think about for future activities in the context of research, which is what I can influence.
I thought I might just add a quick anecdote, which is that I'm Australian myself, and in August went back to visit my old department where I used to work in the Prime Minister's department, which now runs Australia's Open Data Program, and they told us with great pride about their success in opening up Australia's address data, as you said, but also said that they had been under intense criticism for the amount of money that they spent doing it, including having being grilled by a Senate committee. So it's just a reminder that even something that seems really self-evidently a good idea can still be really politically difficult.
And Barbara, yes, please.
I think there's also a nice tie-in with that question to the whole Sustainable Development Goals, because that works when people have addresses. But for a lot of the world, we still don't have addresses even for them. And so you've maybe known or heard about the small company called What 3 Words, where they are assigning a 3-word address to some locations. And I was struck that when Emma in her presentation said, let's be honest, even communicating the word data to my mother or my brother sometimes is not so evident. And certainly latitude and longitude aren't, or the more complicated addressing schemes are not. But I think it's quite clever that FedEx is using What 3 Words to deliver packages to some parts of the world where there are no addresses. So again, it's just maybe thinking out of the box a little bit.
It's not open.
But it's not open.
It's definitely not open. And I think openness is key. I wouldn't worry too much about standardization address formats, but if we could make it clear that every address system on the planet that exists is open, then that would take us a great deal further forward.